The Battle of the Atlantic was one of the longest and most unforgiving struggles of the Second World War. From the earliest days of the conflict, German U-boats prowled the vast ocean, seeking to cut the maritime lifelines that connected North America to Britain and the rest of the Allied world. Merchant convoys carried not only food and fuel, but also weapons, vehicles, aircraft parts, and the raw materials that kept entire nations alive. For the German Navy, sinking these ships meant weakening the Allies' ability to fight. For the Allies, protecting them was a matter of survival. Life aboard a U-boat was unlike anything found on land. The interior was cramped to the point of claustrophobia, filled with a constant mechanical thrum. Metal bulkheads sweated condensation. Bunks were shared in shifts. Fresh water was rationed strictly, and the air grew progressively heavier the longer the vessel remained submerged. Crew members learned to operate in near silence, aware that even a dropped tool or misjudged movement could betray their presence to destroyers or patrol aircraft overhead. Every action, from navigating by hydrophone readings to adjusting ballast, required precision. The ocean above was vast, but it did not offer safety. Advances in Allied detection technologies, surface radar, high-frequency direction finding, long-range patrol aircraft, gradually eroded the advantage U-boats had enjoyed early in the war. Submarines that had once been able to surface freely and recharge their batteries now spent more time submerged, navigating carefully to avoid being caught in the open. Stealth had become their greatest weapon, but also their greatest vulnerability, because any disturbance of the sea's surface risked revealing them. Within this tense environment, even the most ordinary aspects of daily life took on new meaning. The preparation of food, the regulation of air pressure, and the management of heat and exhaust were no longer simple routines, but operational factors. A submarine was a closed ecosystem, and every action within it could leave a trace in the water or the air above. It was in this setting that an unexpected weakness began to emerge, one that few in the German command would have anticipated, yet one that Allied crews learned to notice. Life inside a U-boat was defined by limitations of space, of air, of light, and of movement. Nowhere were these limitations more evident than in the galley, the tiny compartment where all meals for the crew were prepared. To call it a kitchen would be an exaggeration. It was a narrow stretch of corridor wedged between pipes, electrical panels, and storage lockers, with barely enough room for a single cook to stand. Men had to twist sideways to pass through it, and at busy hours the galley effectively became a bottleneck through which both food and crew movement had to flow. Despite its size, the galley was vital. The submarine crew lived under extreme psychological pressure. Long patrols, cramped quarters, and the constant awareness of danger demanded steady morale, and hot meals helped maintain it. The cook worked with limited ingredients stored wherever space allowed, canned vegetables tucked beneath bunk frames, flour in sealed metal cylinders, smoked sausages hanging near pipes that radiated engine heat. Everything had to be secured so it would not shift or fall when the submarine dived or surfaced. The most reliable tool was a small electric stove, though on some patrols it was supplemented by a compact diesel-heated plate. Both generated heat, steam, and odors that could fill the submarine quickly. Ventilation became the defining challenge of cooking at sea. A U-boat was not designed for comfort. Its ventilation system had been engineered primarily to maintain breathable air and manage carbon dioxide buildup, not to disperse cooking fumes. When the submarine ran on the surface, or just beneath it, with the snorkel extended, exhaust valves forced spent air outward through the snorkel mast. Under ideal conditions, this system expelled heat and fumes in a steady, almost invisible stream, but conditions aboard a wartime submarine were rarely ideal. Equipment aged quickly. Filters clogged with grease. Pressure valves occasionally stuck or opened with jerks. The smallest oversight could cause warm, moisture-laden air from the galley to accumulate until a sudden shift in internal pressure pushed it upward in one noticeable burst. This seemingly harmless pulse of hot air mattered far more than anyone aboard realized. Steam rising from a pot of boiling soup or the rich smell of frying meat did not vanish harmlessly into the water. When expelled through the snorkel, these vapors drifted upward and sometimes lingered above the surface, forming a thin haze barely visible to the naked eye. Under overcast skies with little wind, it could hang for minutes. Over the flat expanse of the Atlantic, where aircraft crews trained to spot the smallest ripple or discoloration, such a haze could stand out like a signal. Inside the submarine, the cook often worked without knowing how external conditions might amplify his routine tasks. A pot boiling over, a sudden increase in heat, or a quick refill of the stove could create a burst of steam at the very moment the submarine's pressure dynamics shifted. These incidents were ordinary, even inevitable, on long patrols. Fatigue made them more common. The cook might be preparing a meal as the U-boat dived deeper, adjusting knobs and valves instinctively. In the control room, officers focused on navigation, unaware that a small buildup of heat and vapor could betray their position to an aircraft hundreds of meters above the waves. What made this vulnerability particularly ironic was that German engineers had accounted for far greater dangers: torpedoes, depth charges, flooding, mechanical failure, but not the operational consequences of kitchen steam. Even senior officers generally viewed cooking smells as a discomfort rather than a risk. Yet as the war progressed and the snorkel became essential, the margin for error narrowed. The very device designed to keep U-boats hidden beneath the surface introduced a new path through which their presence could inadvertently be revealed. The crew members who worked near the galley sometimes sensed when the ventilation faltered. The air grew warmer, thicker, condensation gathered on pipes. But in the stressed environment of a long patrol, where equipment failures were routine and discomfort was constant, these early signs rarely drew urgent attention. After all, the cook had no choice but to prepare meals. The men needed to eat, regardless of the risks. It was a quiet vulnerability, unseen, unplanned, and rarely discussed, but it existed nonetheless, waiting for the right combination of timing and circumstance to bring it to the surface. By the middle years of the war, the Allies had transformed their approach to anti-submarine warfare. What had begun as reactive defense slowly evolved into a sophisticated system of prediction, surveillance, and rapid response. Aircraft squadrons flying from Iceland, Newfoundland, Scotland, and later the Azores formed a wide-reaching network that patrolled the oceans day and night. These flights were long, monotonous, and physically exhausting, yet they were built on a simple principle. A U-boat could hide beneath the surface, but it could not erase every sign of its presence. The introduction of new detection tools allowed patrol crews to think differently about the ocean. Radar could paint brief, flickering returns from a snorkel mast or a conning tower. High-frequency direction finding revealed moments when U-boats sent radio messages. Even subtle changes in water texture were clues, because submarines disturbed the sea in ways that experienced observers learned to read. The more time pilots spent over the Atlantic, the more attuned they became to patterns, wave shapes, currents, reflections of sunlight, and the more easily they could spot anything that did not belong. What made these patrols so effective was not technology alone, but the discipline of the crews. Long-range aircraft like the consolidated B-24 Liberator or the Sunderland flying boat often flew for 10 to 12 hours without landing, scanning empty ocean for signs that might appear only for seconds. Crewmen practiced identifying anomalies, small oil slicks, bubbles rising in straight lines, patches of water where the surface texture seemed smoother or darker, or faint trails stretching across the sea like the wake of something just beneath. Pilots were trained to trust their instincts. If something looked off, even slightly, they circled back. It was within this environment that subtle, unexpected traces, like steam drifting from a snorkel, became meaningful. To an inexperienced observer, a tiny wisp near the horizon might seem unimportant, the kind of visual noise the ocean constantly produced. but to patrol veterans, anything that rose vertically from the water demanded attention, because the sea rarely created vertical shapes on its own. Clouds formed above, mist hovered low and wide, spray followed the wind, but straight, thin, rising plumes were different. They suggested machinery, heat, or exhaust, anything manufactured rather than natural. If a radar operator saw a faint spike that vanished, the aircraft executed a cloverleaf pattern, looping through overlapping arcs to scrutinize the area from multiple angles. If the crew spotted even a hint of vapor, they descended to lower altitude and watched for changes in color or texture. Sometimes they released smoke floats or marker buoys to track currents and see how disturbances moved. Every detail mattered, because locating a submarine required piecing together fragments of evidence until a coherent picture emerged. Observers kept detailed logs during each flight, noting weather conditions, visibility, wind direction, and sea state. These details helped analysts later determine why a particular anomaly had or had not been visible. Over time, the Allies learned that calm seas, overcast skies, and light winds created perfect conditions for faint plumes, whether of diesel exhaust, accumulated galley steam, or warm air vented from machinery, to linger above the water for long moments. Such conditions turned small mistakes aboard U-boats into clear signals, often visible from kilometers away. Aircraft crews shared their experiences when they returned from missions, briefing new pilots and updating training guidelines. Many remarked on how surprisingly small cues could lead to major discoveries. Some told of shimmering patches on the water that turned out to be sunlight reflecting off a snorkel cap. Others described brief flashes of white that revealed air bubbles rising in a column. And increasingly, there were stories of tiny wisps, thin, fragile, almost invisible, that hinted at heat escaping from below. As these accounts accumulated, they shaped tactical thinking. Commanders encouraged crews to trust the improbable. A plume that seemed too small to matter might in fact indicate a submarine rising to recharge batteries or running on snorkel with its ventilation misaligned. Patrol notebooks from this period are filled with remarks such as faint haze observed, possible exhaust, or light steam drift noticed, investigated. These notes reflected not superstition, but experience. U-boats, under pressure and increasingly reliant on snorkel operations, produced more surface-visible signs than their commanders realized. In this environment, the stage was set for the kind of incident that would later become part of squadron lore, an encounter where something as mundane as accumulated cooking vapors, expelled at the wrong moment, could be interpreted by trained eyes as the presence of a submarine. It was the culmination of technology, experience, and relentless observation working together across thousands of miles of open ocean. Among the many stories that circulated within Allied patrol squadrons, one in particular gradually earned a place somewhere between anecdote and cautionary tale. It was not officially recorded as a decisive moment in the Battle of the Atlantic, nor did intelligence officers claim it as a groundbreaking discovery. But it persisted because it captured something true about the era, that even the smallest trace, the slightest disturbance, could lead to the detection of a submarine struggling to remain invisible beneath a vast and indifferent sea. The story concerned a routine patrol flight over a calm stretch of the North Atlantic. The aircraft, a long-range patrol bomber, returning from hours of scanning empty ocean, was flying low, performing a final sweep before turning toward home. The crew was tired. The ocean beneath them was quiet, flat, and almost glass-like, reflecting the gray sky above. Conditions like this, though rare, were ideal for spotting anomalies. With no heavy swells to churn the water and no strong wind to blur the horizon, even tiny surface changes could stand out with surprising clarity. As the aircraft continued its slow arc across the patrol grid, one of the observers noticed what he later described as a thin, rising discoloration near the edge of visibility. It wasn't large, it wasn't dark, and it didn't look like smoke in the traditional sense, but it ascended in a mostly vertical line, something the sea itself almost never produced. The observer called out to the pilot, who banked the aircraft gently to bring the anomaly into clearer view. At first, the crew debated what it might be. Heat haze? Mist interacting with a temperature inversion? A reflection from the water? The pilot ordered a descent to lower altitude for a closer look. As the aircraft approached, the crew saw the faint plume disperse, thinning rapidly until it blended with the sky. But its behavior suggested that it had been generated by something warm. It rose too cleanly, too swiftly, and too straight to be a natural sea effect. The crew dropped a smoke float to mark the sighting and began a widening spiral search pattern around the point. They scanned for oil sheens, for unusual disturbances on the surface, for any sign that something had recently broken the water. For several minutes they saw nothing. Then, as the aircraft circled again, the radar operator reported a momentary spike, weak, fleeting, almost too brief to be useful. But in the logic of anti-submarine warfare, two faint clues were more than coincidence. The pilot decided to investigate further, diving to an altitude where they could see subtle differences in water tone and texture. A few minutes later, they spotted a narrow ribbon on the surface, a line where the waves appeared slightly disturbed, almost as if something had moved just beneath them. The pilot decided the signs were strong enough to justify action. The aircraft made a tight turn into an attack run, releasing depth charges at the coordinates where the disturbance seemed most concentrated. The charges detonated below, sending columns of churned water upward, distorting the sea surface in a widening ring. The crew circled once, twice, unsure whether they had found anything at all. Then, from the center of the disturbance, a dark patch began to spread. It was an oil slick, thin at first, then gradually widening as the minutes passed. What happened below the surface was never fully known. Post-war records suggested that at least one U-boat operating in that region had failed to report back after late spring of that year. Intelligence analysts later noted that the submarine in question had been using a snorkel extensively and had reported minor ventilation problems on earlier patrols. These observations did not constitute proof, but they supported a working hypothesis. Under certain conditions, steam or warm air expelled through a malfunctioning snorkel system could have been visible long enough to attract attention. In squadron debriefings, the incident became an example of why patrol crews were trained to take even the faintest anomalies seriously. What mattered was not whether the haze had come specifically from cooking vapors, though many men speculated that accumulated galley steam, a boiling over stew pot, or a pressure shift in the sub's air system might have caused it. What mattered was the lesson it reinforced. Submarines were not betrayed by dramatic mistakes alone. They were often betrayed by the mundane, the accidental, the human. Over time, the story took on a life of its own among patrol squadrons. As new pilots joined and veterans rotated out, the account was repeated in briefing rooms, mess halls, and long flights over the ocean. It served as both encouragement and warning that vigilance mattered, that the smallest detail could alter the outcome of a mission, and that even a moment of routine life aboard a submarine, such as preparing a meal, could intersect with the ever-watchful eyes above. The story endured, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was plausible. It illustrated the fragile balance submarines operated under in the final years of the war, when the margin between concealment and discovery had narrowed to almost nothing. For the men who flew over the Atlantic, it became a reminder that the battle they fought was not only against machines, but against chance, environment, and the quiet traces left behind by human life beneath the waves. By the final years of the war, the German U-boat fleet operated under conditions far more strained than those of the early Atlantic campaigns. In 1939 and 1940, U-boat commanders could approach convoys aggressively, surface frequently, and rely on the vastness of the ocean to conceal their movements. But by 1943 and 1944, Allied air superiority, improved radar, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, and integrated convoy tactics reduced the safe spaces in which a submarine could move. Submerged operations grew longer, more frequent, and more dangerous. This shift highlighted an uncomfortable truth. The U-boat design, which had once seemed so formidable, had not been engineered for prolonged underwater concealment under constant threat. The smallest procedural lapse could now expose a submarine to detection. These pressures created an environment in which minor errors, once merely inconvenient, became operational hazards. Crew fatigue was one of the most significant factors. Patrols often lasted weeks, sometimes months. Supplies dwindled. Equipment degraded under the stress of continuous use in corrosive environments. Men slept in short, broken shifts, often waking to the sound of alarms or the sudden need to dive. In such conditions, routines became blurred. Actions carried out hundreds of times before were executed on instinct rather than concentration. Maintaining perfect discipline grew increasingly difficult. Ventilation and air management were particularly vulnerable to these stresses. A U-boat depended on its ability to control internal air pressure and temperature, not only for the health of the crew, but to prevent detectable signatures from escaping the vessel. The snorkel, introduced to help U-boats operate submerged for longer periods, was both a lifesaver and a source of new vulnerabilities. Its valves, seals, filters, and exhaust pathways needed to function flawlessly. When they did not, air fluctuations created pulses that could expel warm, moisture-laden air with surprising force. These surges could carry steam from galley pots, heat from engine rooms, or even a faint trace of diesel soot. A malfunctioning snorkel rarely caused immediate danger on its own, but it created the possibility of a detectable surface signature. In the compressed space of a submarine, one department's routine could influence another's without anyone fully realizing it. The cook's role was a vivid example. Preparing meals was not optional. A crew living under extreme stress required steady, hot food to maintain strength. Yet cooking inevitably produced steam, smoke, and lingering odors. Normally, the ventilation system directed these byproducts into internal filters and then outward in a controlled stream. But on late war patrols, when equipment was worn and maintenance was improvised, these systems did not always perform as intended. A pot left uncovered for a moment, a fryer producing sudden smoke, or a heat source adjusted too quickly. All of these could create pockets of warm air that moved unpredictably through the submarine's internal pressure zones. When combined with snorkel operations, such pockets could be released upward at precisely the wrong moment. The result was not dramatic. No large plume, no sustained column of smoke. Instead, it was a fleeting haze, thin and easily missed, but unusual enough to stand out under certain atmospheric conditions. Calm seas and low winds, which made life easier for the U-boat crew, ironically made the ocean a clearer surface canvas for Allied patrols. Anything rising vertically, even briefly, attracted attention from watchful observers who had learned to trust tiny clues. German commanders understood the stakes but were often powerless to address every vulnerability. Replacement parts grew scarce. Newly trained crewmen lacked the experience of their predecessors. Combat damage, even when minor, accumulated over time and made systems less reliable. In some cases, ventilation ducts were patched with improvised materials, filters were cleaned hastily, valves showed signs of corrosion. These issues were not the dramatic failures that sank submarines immediately. They were the small cracks that widened under pressure. The Allies, meanwhile, grew ever more skilled at interpreting the subtle traces left by these small failures. Patrol aircraft reported increasing numbers of detections based not on clear radar contacts, but on irregular disturbances, heat-based mirages, fleeting glints from metal, short-lived vapor trails, or isolated patches of smooth water indicating recent submergence. When submarines operated closer to the surface to run their diesel engines, these clues became even more valuable. The result was a widening gap between the submarine crew's efforts to stay hidden and the Allies' ability to find them. What had once been a contest dominated by bold movement and calculated risk, had turned into a battle of microscopic signals. The U-boat crews felt this shift intensely. Many described the anxiety of not knowing which ordinary onboard routines might, under the wrong conditions, betray their presence. They lived with the awareness that any oversight, even something as basic as steam escaping during meal preparation, might intersect with an Allied aircraft's line of sight at exactly the wrong moment. In the end, the idea that a simple cooking mistake could help reveal a submarine was not a myth or a dramatic exaggeration. It was a reflection of how narrow the margin of survival had become. The submarine war had evolved into a contest where technology, chance, human fatigue, and environmental conditions intertwined. The U-boat could be hunted not only by sonar and radar, but by the faint signatures of daily life, small human details that the men aboard could not completely eliminate. As the war drew to a close, these accumulated vulnerabilities contributed to the decline of the U-boat fleet. The submarines that once roamed the Atlantic with confidence found themselves overwhelmed by a web of detection methods so refined that even routine activities carried risk. The idea that a meal boiling over might play a role in revealing a submarine did not diminish the skill or bravery of the crews. Instead, it illustrated how the nature of war had changed. In a battlefield ruled by stealth and surveillance, the difference between invisibility and exposure was sometimes measured not in grand tactics, but in the smallest, most human moments aboard a vessel, fighting to remain unseen beneath the waves. By the time the Battle of the Atlantic reached its final chapters, the struggle between U-boats and Allied forces had become a contest defined not by grand maneuvers, but by minute details. The ocean had grown smaller for submarines that once slipped through its depths with confidence, and the tools of detection had grown sharper for those who hunted them. What emerged from this long, grinding conflict was a profound understanding of how fragile stealth could be, how easily it could be undone, not by bold mistakes, but by ordinary moments. The story of a faint plume rising from the sea, a wisp of warmth, a breath of steam, a brief signature of human activity beneath the waves, captured this truth more clearly than any technical manual could. It showed that a submarine's greatest vulnerability was not always its machinery or its tactics, but the unavoidable traces of life within its hull. In the tight, pressure-filled world of a U-boat, nothing was insignificant. Heat, sound, movement, and air itself became potential sources of exposure, and the crew lived with the constant awareness that the smallest oversight might be noticed by watchful eyes above. What made these vulnerabilities so compelling was not that they resulted from negligence or carelessness, but from the simple fact that submarines were human environments. Men cooked, breathed, moved, sweated, argued, slept, and worked under relentless strain. Each of these actions generated signals, small, fleeting, often invisible, that could blend into the ocean, or, under the right conditions, rise from it. The Allies learned to read these signals with increasing skill, while the U-boat crews struggled to suppress them with decreasing resources. It was an asymmetry that widened with every passing month. In this context, the idea that a cooking accident, a pot bubbling too vigorously, a momentary lapse in ventilation, a burst of steam triggered by shifting internal pressure, might help reveal a submarine's location becomes not a dramatic tale, but a realistic reflection of wartime conditions. It represents how the enormous machinery of war could hinge on the tiniest human details. It reminds us that technological and strategic advantages often grow from the ability to notice what others overlook, and that survival in such an environment required an impossible level of discipline sustained over weeks in darkness and confinement. The fate of the U-boat fleet was ultimately shaped by many factors: industrial capacity, intelligence breakthroughs, improved radar, and combined Allied tactics. But woven into this larger tapestry were hundreds of small moments, mistakes, environmental quirks, and coincidences that accumulated into outcomes no one could fully predict. The anecdote of steam rising into the calm Atlantic air endures because it symbolizes this cumulative effect. It captures the essence of a war fought in silence, where detection was measured not only by machines, but by the ability to interpret the most delicate threads of evidence. When we look back on the Battle of the Atlantic today, stories like these offer more than an intrigue. They provide insight into the profound complexity of submarine warfare, the human pressures that shaped it, and the razor-thin margins on which lives depended. They remind us that history is not only defined by major decisions and decisive battles, but also by the quiet, often unnoticed details that shaped the experiences of those who fought beneath the waves. And perhaps most importantly, they preserve a sense of humility about the uncertainties of wartime life. Even in the most meticulously engineered systems, the human element persists, unexpected, essential, and sometimes decisive. In the dimly lit galley of a submarine or the watchful cockpit of a patrol aircraft, history could shift with nothing more than a wisp of steam rising into a still morning sky.